Hey guys, it's me for 91, and I'm bringing you my episode 2 review. And before I really say anything about the episode, let me just say this. It made no difference who you chose at the end of episode 1. That's what I was trying to say in episode 1, but I figured I'd just waited for this episode because even though the only real difference it makes is that if you choose Pete, you end up in this truck with him instead of in the other place with Nick, which I'll talk about a little later. But I was like, what? Because like I said before, chose Nick first. So when I went and played the game again, I picked Pete. And I was like, yes, so I get to see how Pete made. And you know what? I was so excited because I thought that Pete would make a different decision with Matthew on the bridge. I thought that Pete would not shoot. I'm thinking this would probably make a big difference. And then what I'm told, oh no, Nick is still with us. And I'm like, how could you do that to me? Make me think that I have this choice that doesn't really make much difference other than finding out a little bit more about the character. So I was thinking to myself, yes, we're going to have Pete, but then no matter who you pick, it's going to be Nick. The only difference the only real reason you'd pick Nick, because Nick is kind of mad at you for not picking Pete if you pick Pete. So the only real reason to pick Nick is to find out more about him. And that's all. You find out more about him before you escape. That's really all. Or Pete, you find out a little more about him before you escape. That's really all. But the only difference was Pete, Nick is not mad at you really if you pick Pete, because Nick is like, you say Pete, and you try to at least. You tried to say Pete. I shouldn't say you did say Pete. But you kept him alive longer. That's what you did. But really, Telltale, this was a massive fail. The first time I played through it with Nick, and when I played through again, I was just so disappointed. This was just a big thing for me, because I was like, no, it's not like with Doug and Carly. You don't get to see what's differences between having them. It's just, you get to keep Nick or Pete, but Pete dies anyway. So it's like, it's just... Anyway, let's move on from that point. Episode 2 really starts with us with whoever we really decided to pick, whoever it was, Pete or Nick. And it didn't really go too far with each character. You basically escape. With each character, you try to search around where you are. Nick gets drunk. Pete starts smoking. They both offer it to Clementine. So other than that, there's not much to do. You just find out about each person, and then they go to sleep, and or they wait till evening, and then Clementine walks in and finds... Clementine goes alone because both of them distract the walker so she can get out. And then once again, you end up with all the other people at the cabin. Now, this part was actually done pretty well, in my opinion, because leaving Clementine and Sarah alone, I really did like that, because you got to get to know Sarah a bit more, which is kind of weird, because Carlos at first says, don't like stay away from Sarah, and then he's like, can you watch her or something? I'm like, or distract her, and I'm like, Carlos, this ain't the same guy who just told me, like, literally last episode to stay away from his daughter. Is it? It's really cool though, because I kind of like Sarah as a character, because like as a friend for Clementine, it's kind of like, I'm not gonna say Sarah's Duck, because Sarah's not like Duck, but I will say this: Clementine now has a Clementine. Let me explain that statement. Sarah kind of doesn't know what's going on. She's kind of a kid, even though she's 15. She acts more like a child than Clementine does. And I really like that, because it kind of reminded me of Lee and Clementine. You know how he had to protect her, make her sometimes believe that things were better than they were, especially with the duck situation. So how you're able to teach her how to shoot a gun like Lee taught Clementine made me reminded of the whole, Lee, Clementine. So it was really like, as I said before, Clementine had a Clementine. But what sucks in this episode is that she never really gets to use the gun. So whether you show her or not, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Though I never did not show her, but at the same time, she doesn't use it. It's not like Clementine did use the gun. Sarah doesn't use the gun. So once again, it's like Telltale just put this in there just to make us remind of how Lee taught Clementine how to shoot. Anyway, also I like how they introduce us to Carver in the episode, because it's kind of been illustrious. Who's Carver? And then when this guy comes, you kind of just know it's Carver, even though you don't assume. Well, you do assume. I mean, you don't know, but you kind of just know that that's Carver. And it was a really good way to introduce him, even though it would seem more like this grown man approaching a cabin with a little girl. I guess you guys know what I'm implying. It just, during that whole scene, I was kind of more tense to make... it was just weird, because I was like, Clementine is still a little girl. Okay, and he's a grown man. Even though, obviously, Carver didn't have those intentions, it's the whole kind of scene was a little bit weird for me in that sense. Though I did like how Clementine was able to, you have these options for Clementine to keep her cool during the whole scene, which is very nice. It's very nice to show how, even though Clementine is a child, like Sarah says, she acts a lot older than her age. This is what really distinguishes episode 2 from episode 2 of the season 1. And episode 2 season 1 was actually my favorite episode out of season 1. Why? I think it was more because you kind of knew the group and you kind of had a chance to see how they've changed over 3 months, and you stayed in the motorhome. Even though you went to the farm, you still went back to the motorhome at the end, or motor inn. And in this one, it's like you just get into that cabin. You don't get to really search the place. You just kind of leave it, and to me it's like, what? So we don't get used to this cabin. We don't get used to it. Just like, even though we got used to the motor inn at season 1, and I'm like, okay, so now we're just on the move to another place. And then once again, when you get to the ski resort, or whatever it was called, ski cabin, it's still, you're not there long enough to get used to it. So there's no place in this game so far that allows you to get used or comfortable like the motor inn did. So this episode does kind of establish Luke as the cool dude, even though he was kind of made that in episode 1. It kind of over-established this Luke as the cool person.
Come on, Clem, it's family. It's a tough world out there without people you can trust.
I also kind of established him as a moral person, the whole point of the whole trust. Like, Luke is basically just this person that is going to be loved by everyone. You can just kind of tell it based on this episode that Luke is just going to be a person that everybody, no matter what their style, really loves. This episode really did best to me was reintroduce Kenny. And just a little note, if you guys watch my Is Kenny Really Dead or Kenny's Death Analyzed video, I think it's called Kenny's Death Analyzed, I was right. Just wanted to say that. And I'm so glad that they made it in episode 2. You get back Kenny in episode 2. I thought that if they made Kenny come back, it wouldn't be this early, but I was glad. But at the same time, they didn't really do the whole catch up with Kenny too well. You talk about a few things, and what I kind of think it sounds like, you only talk about things that are canon. You talk about like Lee's death and like how Kenny tried to save Ben, or I guess I never dropped Ben, so I don't know what the other one would have been. But what I'm saying is that it seems like Telltale didn't want too much of what choices were made in the season 1 coming into this one with the whole recap with Kenny. So it seems like they only let us recap with him based on stuff that were canon, like Lee, Clementine leaving Lee, I think Clementine saying Lee was dead or stuff like that. And I thought it was a little short. I honestly wanted more time to talk about the past with Kenny, because honestly, you just found out that this person that you weren't even sure was alive for 2 years, basically, for 2 straight years. You basically think that they're dead, or you don't know what happened to them. And then you find them and you think they're just going to talk for 2 seconds about a couple stuff in the past. I don't think so. I think that they should have talked a little bit more about what happened in the past. And I think that Telltale really blew it with this part of the episode, because it's like, I don't know whether it was just they didn't want to have too many lines said, because honestly, if you talked a lot about the past, like if you talked about Lily, you talked about all those people in the past, depending on Lee's choices in the first game, Kenny would have to respond very differently, and I think Telltale didn't want to have to do that. So they just talked about certain things, like things that were canon, that no matter what you basically did happened in season 1. But I did like the addition of Sarita, because let's face it, Kenny needs a companion. Now, Sarita, actually, I think she should have gotten a little bit more talking in. She doesn't really talk much. I mean, do you remember how much times Katja talked? Katja was, you really got a good deal of Katja's personality, especially in episode 3 of the season 1. But Sarita, I don't think they gave her enough talk time. So really, I think that Sarita is a very underused character, but I'll probably talk more about her if I do a bio on her. The part that really got me weirded out was when Walter came over to the dinner table and asked,
"Hey, Clementine, would you lend me a hand outside for a moment?"
She's still an 11-year-old girl, and he asks her to come out, and he's still a grown man. And I know Walter's very nice, and it's nothing like that, but I'm just saying, it's still the whole thing about she's still an 11-year-old girl. And also, he brings her outside and he talks about the politics and how unifying their 2 groups. She's an 11-year-old girl. She is maybe the player. She is the player, but she is not Lee. She is not the leader of this group. She cannot make the decision to unify the groups. Even though Walter may see that she is the only one that is making sense out of all the people in this group, it's still this is just the whole playing as Clementine thing that I was kind of afraid of. Treating her like she's an adult when she's an 11-year-old doesn't make sense. Anyway, moving on. This episode can basically be called Let's Reintroduce Characters that were introduced before episode. First you had Kenny, now you had Bonnie. And I really did like Bonnie's whole introduction of character. Bonnie looks a lot better than she did in, at least to me, in 400 Days. Because the whole point in 400 Days, she was just getting cleaned up from her drugs. And now obviously she hasn't been on drugs for a while. And I remember actually at one point she said she had old scars, which I assume were drugs. But anyway, talk about that a little later. But what I did like about this episode did really well. It really made tension. I mean, Walter went from being the nicest guy in the world to just being like this. He's smoking outside. He's like fiddling with the knife. And I'm like, wow, this guy really is on edge right now. And I really liked how they made this scene. They made the whole tension. And after this, it's nothing but tension. The walkers come, then the Carver people come. I mean, it just really was done well. This whole ending was much better than episode 1 ending. And Telltale really made it hard to kill off certain characters. Like, I didn't even know until I think I watched a YouTube video that Alvin and Nick could die in this episode, because it's actually harder to kill them than it is to leave them alive. And that is really well done on Telltale's part. Because usually it's pick whether this person dies or lives. But in this situation, it's like you had to do so many things to make Nick die, or do so many things to make Alvin die. Because in both situations where you walk out to see, where either Clementine walk out to see Kenny or where Clementine stays, Alvin can live in both situations. And Nick basically lives if you get Walter to forgive him, but still, I didn't know. I just had no clue that either of them could die in this episode until after I watched like a YouTube video. But that's just really well on Telltale's part. That's how they need to do it. They need to make it kind of hard so that certain people get it, even though that's not exactly good to have a bunch of group members die. But still, it was really well done, and I gotta really applaud Telltale for that. That was much different, and it was a good addition to the game. So in all, this was a pretty good episode. It really did well to build up to episode 3, but at the same time, it felt a bit rushed. It felt like they were trying to get a lot packed into this one episode. That was my only real beef with this, other than the stuff I previously mentioned. Well, that's my review for episode 2. I know it's a bit lengthy, but there was, like I said, a lot happened in this episode, so I had a lot to say. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and God bless you all.